Digital accessibility in higher education recruitment isn't just about compliance. It's about ensuring every prospective student and stakeholder can fully engage with your institution's story. Today, we're exploring how to build a stronger case for accessibility in graduate recruitment and marketing. I'm joined by Eugene Woo, founder of Venngage, who's helping institutions create accessible visual content that reaches all prospective students and audiences. Welcome to the podcast, Eugene.
Thanks very much for having me here, Ray. Appreciate it.
I'm glad to have you here because this is such an important topic. And I actually teach user experience design at the University of Southern California and NYU. And accessibility is such an often overlooked part of designing an app, a product, an experience, any content. So I'd love to start with your perspective. Why is accessibility an afterthought? I mean, especially in higher education, marketing, and recruitment, but we could think more broadly than that. What are we missing in how we frame this conversation?
Yeah, I think the biggest problem is in the framing is it's often framed as a requirement and as a burden. It's like an extra thing you got to do. So if you're a web designer or a web developer or a marketer, the framing is always like, hey, you've got to make your whatever it is, your website, your poster, your marketing flyer, you've got to make it compliant. And the work involved, you're often doing it at the end of your process. So you've already done it. Like, I'm done, but it's framed like, well, you're not done. Now you got to do all this extra work. So the framing is actually very burdensome. And I think that's the wrong framing. I think that's the problem. There isn't enough context to why you need to do this. There's also a problem with the process, like addressing it at the end is also the other problem, which doesn't help. But I think the gap that most people have is that they don't really understand why these regulations exist. And I have a very simple example. Most people have never seen someone read a website with a screen reader. And that's what an accessible website enables you to do. You can read or you can sort of perceive and understand the content of a website, even though you may be blind, you may be have disabilities that kind of not allow you to read it normal, like a sighted person. So the empathy doesn't come across, right? Because they don't really understand why is it important. And a good counterexample of that is closed captions. I think most of us have seen closed captions, whether you're deaf or not, whether you have seen closed captions, you've probably used it, watching a movie. And most of us can empathize going like, closed captions are great, especially if I'm in a household, I've got a young kid, they're kind of screaming, or I live in a very busy, whatever environment, but I can enable closed captions. And people can empathize and go like, closed captions are great. No one's saying, I don't want to do closed captions. It is not a benefit. They can see that. Most of us can see it. Most of us can empathize with it. And that conversation doesn't happen. So I think if we can do something similar to that, where we shift the frame to, hey, it's a burden as opposed to a benefit that, and you can understand why it's important, then the conversation changes, right? I use closed captions probably 50% of the time when I watch something on Netflix or on Disney Plus, because, I've got a kind of a noisy household, and sometimes I'm watching when I'm working out and I just want to read it instead of, listen to it, right?
I'm
So
with you.
That's where I think where the framing could change a little bit.
It makes a lot of sense. I actually do that on planes when I'm watching a movie because sometimes the screen is not the best. And even though I have headphones on, I don't quite catch what's being said. And so, yeah, I mean, having empathy for the users and their experience with content is a challenge. And I mean, you think about visual content. An example I think about and I share with my students is that years ago, the National Football League in the U.S. introduced uniforms called Color Rush to celebrate the anniversary of the first color televised game. And they partnered with Nike on these really cool new uniforms. And one of the first games was a team almost all in green with white numbers versus a team that was all in red in white numbers. And it didn't take long for the phone calls to start coming into the NFL saying, hey, I'm watching a whole bunch of guys wearing black uniforms jump all over each other. I can't tell who's winning because I'm colorblind. And they hadn't thought about that. So, I mean, I've noticed this happen with businesses, with institutions, where they struggle to make their visual content engaging and accessible, right? We want it to be cool and exciting, but maybe it is an afterthought. So how does Venngage approach this balance between creative design and compliance with things like web content accessibility guidelines.
So we are a design platform. We are very similar to other design platforms like Canva or Adobe, with one, I would say, big difference is that we allow our users to create accessible designs very easily. And that part is the key part, because traditionally in most design tools, it is very difficult to make your design accessible from both a accessible point, from both like just being able to read it and view it, and also from a compliance point of view, because sometimes there's they are the same, but sometimes it's the same and it's also different. So Venngage has a lot of features built into the tool where we allow users to address accessibility problems upfront. For example, you use the colorblind example. We have colorblind simulators on our tool where you could just click on it and then you could see, depending on what type of, all the different options, where you have difficulty seeing reds, greens, yellows, or complete colorblind where you're just seeing black and white. You could sort of simulate your design and sort of figure out, hey, if I had these colors, 10% of people who are colorblind will not be able to differentiate. We also have a lot of built-in automation. One of the big things is color contrast. It's a very, I would say, often overlooked thing. It's very simple to solve. You may have like a bright yellow background and then with a white text, and you may think, hey, I can read it. It looks great. But for a lot of people, they will not be able to read it because the contrast isn't high enough. So in our tool, if you did that, we would just give you a little warning and says, hey, there's not the color contrast isn't high enough. You can bump it up, by making the yellow a little darker, for example, or put an outline on the text, whatever it is. But we would essentially sort of nudge you towards accessibility as you're designing, and that's the key difference. We're not waiting till the end for you to redo your whole work.
That's great. And it is important because a lot of tools don't make that easy. And it's so common to see mistakes. Like I was just looking at something that was red text on a blue background. And I'm thinking, if I were wearing 3D glasses, this would be impossible. So, when you talk to clients about what you do, and maybe particularly with education clients, if we could talk about that, they're clearly missing out on opportunities when they don't prioritize these kinds of things, right? So, talk to me about what those hidden opportunities are, like with recruitment. What are institutions
Sure.
missing?
So from a recruitment point of view, I think so we deal a lot with marketing departments because our tool is used. So recruiting is obviously part of marketing. With our higher ed customers, I think the key thing is just the reach of your audience, right? What some recruiting departments may not understand is that, they may again think it's just a compliance issue, but it actually goes beyond that. Like by making your websites and your marketing material accessible, you're reaching a bigger audience. The percentage of adults in the US with a disability in higher ed was quite high. And if you add their parents, because if you're recruiting, you're not just sending messages to the high school student. You also, a lot of times the parents and their grandparents are also reading it. You're addressing an aging population that's much larger than you think. And that population, unfortunately, have a lot more disabilities, visually, than a lot of other populations. And so, by making your marketing material accessible, you are essentially reaching out to a larger audience.
And it makes so much sense when you consider the diversity of audiences. And even at the graduate level, we've talked on this podcast about neurodiversity, talked on this podcast about finding ways of engaging folks from different cultures, different backgrounds, where they may need content delivered in specific ways, either because they have some sort of ability issue, or it might just be cultural. But there's a lot of complexity out there when you get into this world, and it behooves institutions to do this. But I also hear from a lot of folks that they're in a budget deficit, right? I mean, there's schools out there right now, even in Canada, with tens of millions of dollars of budget deficit that are sort of going, help. How do you help institutions shift from seeing accessibility as like this cost center
Mm-hmm.
to viewing it as like an investment in the future?
Yeah, so that is, I mean, I guess that's the money question, right? It always comes down to money. I think
Yes, it
at the end
does.
of the day, and as a private company selling a solution, obviously that's often the objections we get. It's like, oh, it's an extra cost. Although Venngage is not expensive, Venngage is actually a fairly cheap tool. But let's talk about accessibility in general. If you would like to kind of, get your IT team to redo all your websites, that's a pretty high cost. Like most universities, especially the bigger ones, have like hundreds of microsites within a larger site. Each unit, right, has their own recruiting admissions page, site, microsite. And even within that, maybe sometimes each program has their own microsite, right? And so when you multiply that, it gets so, it gets pretty big. So how do you solve the budgeting problem? So I mean, there's no way around it. It's going to cost money. I'll be honest, right? Like, there's no such thing as like, hey, if you do this, it's going to cost money. Going back to my earlier thing about framing, like if you framed it properly and people understood and empathized with why we need to make our content accessible, that makes the budget conversation or the cost conversation a little easier, as opposed to just focusing on the cost and saying like, oh, we have to do this. It's going to cost like a lot of money. I think changing the framing is the way around that. And I think the other thing also is like, to take small steps. Like, oftentimes universities want to do this big swap approach where, yeah, it's not going to be possible. So I'm a big fan of the sort of the decentralized, sort of distributed. You can be hybrid method where you have, each college or each unit kind of change so that it's smaller and it's faster. You can iterate faster, as opposed to like, oh, let's have this massive program to change every single website. That I mean, probably doesn't work. It's just so complicated and so massive. Or if you have one like IT team trying to control every single website that you have, it's just too complicated. So I would also say there is certain things where it's easier to push budgets if it's smaller and it's at a smaller level, as opposed to go big.
Let's double click on that then. I would love for you to maybe share, if you can, a success story of a program, of a college, of an institution that you feel like got this right. How did they go about transforming their approach to accessible content?
Yeah, so I think one example that I can use is Colorado State. I think they started with just one unit, one college. There were some objections. They were like, "Oh, we already have all our templates done, blah blah blah. It's going to be extra cost." But we helped them transfer over some of their important templates over to Venngage. And I'll be honest, after a few weeks, it's like the same. I mean, the editing tools in design are very similar. Like you can use Venngage, you can use Adobe Express, you can use Canva. They're all kind of the same. There's really no barrier there. And then after a few weeks, they were like, yeah, it's the same, except now it's like accessible. Like we don't have to go through this extra remediation step. So remediation is when you take the final product and then you have to go and fix it, right? It's an extra step. And Venngage sort of allows you not to go through the remediation because you're doing it, accessible from the start. We started with one college. It was a success. Literally a few weeks ago, they signed up a different college. And so we go from one to another. And that's kind of the model I talked about where, it's you kind of lower the risk, the budget's also lower, and then you start out small and you kind of go that way, right? And when people see the success of one unit or one college or one program, it spreads, right? And I think, we probably will kind of expand in Colorado State to other colleges as well.
What was the spark that initiated that conversation? I mean, I can imagine that a lot of enrollment leaders, a lot of higher education leaders that are listening are thinking about this. But how do you get this to be an executive level priority where you get that buy-in and you're able to start that conversation? Where does that happen in the process? Why is it happening now?
Okay, so the truth is, I would say, as much as I like to say, hey, people doing it because because it's the right thing to do. Most of the time, on an executive level, it's either triggered by a lawsuit or a Office of Civil Rights complaint. It's often triggered by something like that. Essentially, it's a risk mitigation or a threat of it, right? Or like so maybe it's their lawyers or somebody in the team going, there's a high risk of us, getting sued or getting, complaint or because of these non-compliant issues. So I would say a lot of that push is there. Obviously, within the organizations, there are people who are pushing these things internally. I'm not saying there isn't, but I think just from a practical point of view, if you're talking about like at a high level, a lot of it is from that. It's from a complaint or it's from a lawsuit, or from a risk mitigation point of view. Then it gets on the radar and it goes like, well, it's going to cost us this much. But if we made it compliant, for the most part, the math works out. when we talk about budget, if you went the route of like, hey, if you actually got sued, it's going to be multi-year, it's going to be millions of dollars. And guess what? You will also have to make it compliant at the end of the day. So it's not like you just get sued and you pay it off and you don't have to be compliant. You also have to make it accessible. So you have to do the work anyways. You just do it, and then it'll cost you less because then you don't have the lawsuit. So that is my answer. Other people may give you other answers, but I think just from my point of view, I'm a practical person. Having said that, we've had customers who did not have this risk. There's a community college. I don't know if I can use your name, but they came to us because the chief CIO, she just really wanted their site and all their marketing materials to be compliant, and that was very proactive. So you see that as well. But I think more often than not is the threat of it is the other side. It is more of the stick than the carrot that actually pushes and triggers these conversations.
Well, and that kind of persuasion is valuable and powerful when you do have public compliance that leads to private acceptance, right? That it's not just I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do because I know I'm being watched. It's I'm going to do this because I'm being watched. But you know what? It's kind of the right thing to do anyway. So it actually may, unfortunately, fear is a powerful motivator for institutions these days. And a lot of them are concerned about being either sued out of existence or failing financially. So finding ways to avoid that from happening are definitely top of mind. I'd love to kind of close out with kind of a broader question looking ahead. When you look in the future at emerging technologies like artificial intelligence or trends shaping the future of accessible university materials, accessible communications, what should folks be preparing for? What do you see coming?
So AI is a great topic. We could talk like the whole day for sure. I mean, I'm a technologist, and Venngage is, we are building a lot of tools and features with AI, with the LLMs, with the large language models, and actually with image generation models as well, just the diffusion models. So right now, it's still very painful to take a website that isn't accessible and remediate it. So I think remediation, which means fixing all the accessibility problems on a website. I mean, AI can write code right now really, really well, which means it can also fix code really, really well. And it knows how to fix code, at least at a surface level. Obviously, it's harder to fix like user experiences. I mean, you're a UI person or UX person, so like the flow and that's a lot harder for UI to fix. But basically fixing the issues on the page could be automated right now. And I would say in the near future, when I say the near future, I'm talking like 12 months. That should be very easy. That should be like almost a click of a button, right? On the screen reader side of things, a lot of times screen readers are still sort of reliant on the semantic structure of the website itself, the HTML, CSS, and all of that stuff. But I think that would evolve to something where it doesn't structurally need to be accessible, but it could read it. It could just figure it out, right? But I think that is much longer term. That is that obviously is like the silver bullet to everything. But in the short term, making websites accessible should be a fairly simple. I always use like simple in the sense that if you want people to actually do it, somebody still has to go in and say like, let's run the AI tool to fix it. Someone still has to do it, and they have to still test it. All of that is still involved. But I think all of those processes will be a lot more efficient and a lot faster.
As leadership finds this to be a priority, technology will enable them to do this much more quickly and efficiently. And it's exciting to see, and time will tell. Eugene Woo, founder of Venngage, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thanks a lot, Ray. It was great talking to you.
Here's my take. As higher education becomes increasingly digital and enabled by technology, accessibility isn't just a compliance checkbox. It's a fundamental part of reaching and serving all prospective students effectively, as well as current students. That being said, that compliance fear is definitely a motivator. And for those of you trying to figure out ways to get your leadership to be bought in on this, it's much cheaper to go out and find a solution that will allow you to create accessible content than to wait for a lawsuit from somewhere. And what excites me about today's conversation is also how technology can actually make accessibility easier and more intuitive, rather than seeing it as an obstacle, which up until now it may well have been. Eugene's work with Venngage offers some fascinating insights into how we can make this happen, and it is worthy of other attention.